Leroy Sunderland Johnson was born on June 12, 1888 in Lee's Ferry, Arizona. Leroy, known as Roy and later as Uncle Roy, was the son of Warren Marshall Johnson and Permelia Smith Johnson. The Johnson family had only recently converted to the LDS Church. Permelia was one of several wives. Roy was baptized into the LDS Church around 1896 when he was 8 years old. Around the same time, Wilford Woodruff's 1890 manifesto was issued by LDS leadership, which renounced the practice of plural marriage. Since the manifest was addressed to whom it may concern, Johnson's father decided that it simply didn't concern him. Roy agreed with his father's view on plural marriage, and his belief was only strengthened when he visited Short Creek, Arizona, a remote town that had become a safe haven for fundamentalist polygamist families. While there, Roy became friendly with the important men of the community, including John W. Woolley, Joseph White Musser, and John Y. Barlow. These men were part of an organization known as the Circle of Friends, a group which had been created in the early days of Mormonism. Men in the Circle of Friends shared power, voted on issues, and were the ones in the community who held sealing rights. In other words, these were the men who could perform the plural marriages so essential to the fundamentalist faith. In 1935, Roy, along with most of the Short Creek community, was officially excommunicated from the LDS Church. At first, Roy refused to see the Short Creek community as a separate denomination, but instead referred to his group as the fundamentalist branch of the mainstream LDS. However, by the early 50s, he was forced to admit that there had indeed been a schism.
We don't talk anymore.
In 1949, Roy became the leader of the Polygamist movement after John Y. Barlow died. Just 4 years later, the community experienced the 1953 Short Creek Raid, when the U.S. government had rounded up many of the men in the community and locked them up for bigamy. Roy was one of the men who was imprisoned for bigamy, and he gave a rare interview about the event.
I've dedicated my life and my labors to this work. And as long as the Lord will inspire me as He has done in the past to go and come, I'm going and coming. As long as He will provide for my way of going and my way of coming, I'm going to go and come. And I'm not going to ask anybody whether I should go or whether I should come or not. This is not my work. The work of God.
After his release from prison, Roy went on to preside over a period which modern FLDS members look back on as a golden age. Uncle Roy was a beloved figure who showed true compassion and concern for his followers. He never called himself a prophet, though he acknowledged that others thought he was. He did not add much doctrine to the church, and marriages between young women and older men were less common at the time. That's not to say there was no contention within FLDS leadership, because it was during Roy's time at the helm that the one-man doctrine was first implemented. Before the one-man doctrine, fundamentalist leadership had been more of a council with multiple men sharing power and responsibility. It wasn't until a man named Rulon Jeffs joined the FLDS that the one-man doctrine was even considered. But we will talk a little bit more about the one-man doctrine in the next segment of the video. By the end of his life, Uncle Roy was practically worshipped. He was so revered. He had at least 15 wives when, on November 26, 1986, he died in Hilldale, Utah. Leroy S. Johnson was 98 years old. While Roy was a benevolent figure in comparison to many of the other men on this list, he certainly was not harmless. His adherence to the one-man doctrine helped set the stage for the abuse of power later exerted in the FLDS. For that reason, I'm going to put Roy right here. Roy's mistakes as a leader may have taken a few decades to be fully realized, but the fallout from Roy's influence is still being felt in the FLDS to this day. Rulon Jeffs was born on December 6, 1909 to David William Ward Jeffs and one of his plural wives, Nettie Lenore Timpson. David Jeffs was a first-generation Mormon, and the family lived polygamy in secret, so much so that Rulon was known as Rulon Jennings for the first 10 years of his life. It is not that uncommon for polygamist women to invent a name and pretend a mystery man fathered their children. This was done to protect the men in the community despite the emotional toll it took on children who were not publicly acknowledged by their fathers. Much like Rulon C. Allred, Rulon Jeffs began his life as a member of the mainstream LDS Church, even going on a 2-year mission trip to Britain from 1930 to 1932. It wasn't until 1938 that Rulon's father introduced him to the realities of Mormon polygamy. Rulon later met Joseph White Musser and John Y. Barlow and was converted to fundamentalism, which was a problem for his wife, Zola Brown. Zola was the daughter of an apostle for the mainstream LDS Church and the great-granddaughter of Brigham Young. She did not believe in the principle of plural marriage. When Rulon took a second wife in 1940, Zola filed for divorce and raised their 2 sons in the mainstream church. Undaunted, Rulon moved up the ranks of the FLDS quickly. Rulon was a protege of Joseph White Musser until Musser's death in 1949, and he was also close with Uncle Roy from earlier in the video. Rulon had been heavily influenced by the way the mainstream LDS Church was organized. He believed that rather than a council of men, the group should have a single leader and prophet. This idea is known as the one-man doctrine, and was first implemented when Uncle Roy was still alive. During gentle Uncle Roy's long life, few could imagine the way the one-man doctrine would be abused. When Uncle Roy died in 1986, Rulon Jeffs took over. Uncle Rulon wasn't quite as revered as his predecessor. Rulon was intelligent, handsome, and more worldly than many of his followers, who had been raised in Short Creek and isolated from regular society. To some, Jeffs would always be an outsider. His family was relatively new to fundamentalist Mormonism, especially compared to figures like the Barlows or the Mussers, who could trace their lines back through church history to the time of Joseph Smith. As a result, several splinter groups sprang up, though none of them were as large or as profitable as the FLDS. It was during Rulon's tenure as the prophet of the FLDS when the age of brides began to creep down, while the number of wives the powerful men in the church had crept up. Rulon may not have been as warm and fuzzy as Uncle Roy, but he had worldly talents that made him valuable to the group. In 1942, the FLDS had established the United Effort Plan, or UEP. It was a trust that had initially been set up to allow church members to live collectively, one of the tenets of their fundamentalist faith. In Leroy Johnson's time, the trust was seen as a positive thing for the community. It was still viewed favorably in Rulon's time at the helm, as Jeffs was skilled at growing the trust and thus growing the wealth of the FLDS as a whole. Over time, the trust would come to include most of the homes in Short Creek, as well as properties in bountiful British Columbia and the infamous Yearning for Zion Ranch in El Dorado, Texas. Estimates have put the value of the UEP trust anywhere from $114 million all the way up to $500 million. We will talk more about the UEP trust when we talk about Rulon's rat bastard of a son, Warren. Rulon continued to marry throughout his life. Even as he grew old and feeble, men in the FLDS practically fell over each other to offer their daughters to Rulon as wives. Thanks to the one-man doctrine, the prophet's family was like a mini royal family. The wives were seen as more worthy than other women and could be used as a direct line to the prophet. Only the prettiest and most obedient women were chosen for Rulon, a fact that was not missed by his son Warren, but more on that in another video. The final years of Rulon's life were plagued with health issues. He largely lost his powers of speech after a series of strokes, and his son Warren began to take over his father's duties and consolidate power for himself. Warren kept his father isolated and controlled, and wielded tremendous power as his father's proxy. At times, the elderly Rulon could be heard weakly protesting Warren's decisions. One church member overheard Rulon complain that Warren kept marrying him to young girls. Another witnessed Rulon grow frustrated with his son, snapping that he was still in charge because he was still alive. Some believe that Warren took to drugging his father after these outbursts, supposedly. Allegedly. Rulon's health problems confused FLDS members. They had been assured that Rulon was the one mighty and strong, who would live to see the return of Jesus Christ. So you can imagine their confusion when, on September 8, 2002, Rulon died in St. George, Utah. Rulon Timpson Jeffs was 92 years old. I think Rulon Jeffs often sneaks under the radar because the crimes of his son Warren are so notorious, but I truly believe that Rulon's leadership policies are what set the stage for a dictator-like figure to take over the FLDS. His insistence on one-man doctrine, combined with his ill health at the end of his life, created the perfect environment for Warren Jeffs to take power and rule with an iron fist. And that is why I am going to put Rulon right here. Next time, we are going to be talking about 2 men who lead splinter fundamentalist groups. If you thought the FLDS was controlling, wait until we talk about the Kingston group. Thanks for sticking out through the whole video, guys. I really appreciate it. I do have a laptop now, so I will be able to continue putting videos out. There shouldn't be a big long delay again, hopefully. You guys have a fantastic day or night, and I will catch you next time. His adherence to the rule of one... what am I saying? Rule of one is Star Wars.